The office hummed with the familiar rhythm of keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and muted conversations spilling across cubicles. Fluorescent lights cast a steady glow over rows of desks where employees shuffled through morning emails, coffee mugs steaming at their sides. Through the glass doors of the lobby, a tall black man in his early 40s stepped inside. His presence was calm, deliberate. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and carried a slim leather briefcase in one hand. His posture was upright, his stride unhurried, the kind of quiet confidence that drew a few curious glances from the reception desk. "Good morning," he said warmly to the receptionist, offering a brief smile. His voice carried both friendliness and authority. She smiled back, though she couldn't quite place why his presence felt different from the usual suits who walked in every morning. As he made his way through the open floor plan, several employees looked up from their desks. Some gave polite nods of acknowledgement. Others whispered to each other, wondering who he was, a new hire perhaps, or someone visiting from another department. But the man didn't pause. He walked with intention, as though he already knew the place well, heading toward a desk in the corner where he set down his briefcase. He pulled out a laptop, opened it, and began typing quietly, blending into the hum of the office. To most, it looked like just another workday, another colleague taking his place among them. But there was something in the way he moved, the way he carried himself, that suggested this was no ordinary worker. And though the morning passed in routine, reports being printed, emails being sent, coffee being refilled, the air would soon shift. Because for one man in the office, his presence wasn't just unremarkable, it was intolerable. And that man was watching him already, from the head of the conference room table. From the glass-walled conference room overlooking the office floor, manager Rick Thompson sat with his arms crossed, watching. His desk was cluttered with papers and an oversized mug that read Boss Man. But his attention wasn't on spreadsheets or emails. It was fixed on the tall black man working quietly at his corner desk. Rick's jaw tightened as he drummed his fingers on the table. Something about the man's calm composure irritated him. He wasn't fumbling through files like the junior staff. He wasn't scrambling to impress. Instead, he sat with a quiet authority, as if he belonged there, as if the space itself bent to his rhythm. And Rick hated it. "Who does he think he is?" Rick muttered under his breath, leaning back in his chair. His assistant, seated a few chairs away, glanced up nervously but said nothing. Everyone in the office knew better than to question Rick when his voice carried that edge. Rick had built his reputation on being loud, commanding, and intimidating. He believed authority came from raising his voice, from reminding people he was in charge. And yet, here was this man, calm, dignified, drawing more subtle respect with his silence than Rick ever had with his shouting. The imbalance gnawed at him. Rick stood abruptly, straightening his tie, and stepped out of the conference room. His shoes clapped against the polished floor as he strode across the office. A few employees glanced up, sensing the storm brewing in his steps, then quickly lowered their eyes back to their screens. He paused near the man's desk, staring down at him with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," Rick said loudly enough for nearby workers to hear, "looks like we've got ourselves a new face around here. Tell me, what exactly is it you do?" The man looked up slowly, meeting Rick's eyes with a calm, steady gaze. "I'm here for today's meetings," he said simply. His tone was polite but measured. Rick smirked, the kind of smirk that dripped with condescension. "Meetings, huh? Funny. I don't recall approving your position." He leaned closer, lowering his voice but not enough to hide the disdain. "Don't think you can just waltz in here like you run the place." The man didn't flinch. He returned his gaze to his laptop, his voice even. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The answer struck Rick harder than he expected. His face flushed, irritation sparking hotter. He straightened, already imagining the perfect way to put this man in his place. Because in Rick's mind, there was no room in this office for dignity that didn't bow to him, and he was already planning to make an example of it. The staff filed into the conference room one by one, clutching notebooks, laptops, and cups of coffee. The weekly team meeting was routine, usually a blur of charts and deadlines. But today the air carried a sharper tension, invisible but palpable. Rick sat at the head of the long oak table, leaning back in his chair with a smug sense of ownership. His eyes, however, never strayed far from the black man, who quietly took a seat near the middle of the table. The man placed his laptop down, clicked it open, and began reviewing notes with the same calm composure that had unsettled Rick all morning. When the last chair scraped against the floor, Rick cleared his throat loudly, commanding attention. "All right, everyone," he said with forced authority. "Let's get started." The meeting rolled forward. Quarterly goals, sales figures, project updates. Colleagues spoke in turn, their voices careful, measured, as though afraid to step out of line. Rick nodded, interrupted often, reminded them who was in charge. Then, halfway through, he pounced. "So," Rick said suddenly, his voice rising above the steady rhythm of the meeting. His gaze locked on the black man. "Why don't you tell us what exactly you're doing here? What value are you adding to this team?" The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes flicked toward the man, then back to Rick. No one breathed too loudly. The man looked up from his laptop, unshaken. "I'm here to observe," he said evenly. His tone was measured, confident, as if that answer should have been enough. Rick leaned forward, seizing the moment, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Observe? Is that what we're paying you for? To sit here and observe while the rest of us do the real work?" A nervous chuckle escaped one employee, quickly stifled. Others looked down at their notes, avoiding eye contact altogether. Rick pressed harder, enjoying the spectacle. "Let me make this simple. You don't belong in this meeting. You don't belong in this office. As of right now, you're done here." Gasps rippled through the room. A woman near the end of the table dropped her pen. Another employee shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes darting toward the man, then back at Rick. The man sat perfectly still, his expression calm, unreadable. He didn't raise his voice, didn't protest. He simply closed his laptop with deliberate care, the quiet click echoing louder than any shout. Rick leaned back, satisfied, scanning the room for approval. "That's how you deal with dead weight," he announced, smirking. "Let this be a lesson." But instead of respect, he found unease. No one applauded, no one nodded. The silence was heavy, suffocating. Colleagues avoided his eyes, their discomfort clear. The man, however, did not shrink. He sat in silence, his dignity intact, while Rick basked in his own false victory. What Rick didn't know was that his moment of triumph would soon turn to humiliation, and the reversal would be swift, undeniable, and absolute. The words, "You're done here," still hung in the air, like smoke after a fire. Rick leaned back smugly in his chair, arms crossed, basking in his own performance. He expected chuckles of approval, maybe even applause, but none came. The conference room was frozen. A woman near the end of the table stared down at her notes, her knuckles white as she gripped her pen. A young analyst shifted uncomfortably in his chair, stealing a glance at the man who had just been fired, then quickly looking away when Rick's gaze swept the room. The silence was thick, oppressive, the kind that made every second drag like an hour. And in the middle of it all sat the black man, calm, unmoving, his expression steady. He did not argue, did not defend himself. Instead, he sat with his hands folded neatly on the table, his posture upright, his eyes clear. It was the stillness of someone who knew the truth, and knew that time itself would reveal it. The employees felt the injustice keenly. They had all seen Rick's temper before, but this was different. This was deliberate, targeted, and yet no one dared to speak. To challenge Rick was to risk becoming his next target, and fear kept their voices locked in their throats. Rick, mistaking their silence for compliance, smirked. "That's what happens when you don't belong," he said smugly, his voice filling the room. But the words landed flat. The tension only grew heavier. The man finally moved, not with anger, but with deliberate grace. He opened his briefcase, slid his laptop inside, and closed it softly. The faint click echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. Then he leaned back in his chair, waiting, his composure unshaken. No one could ignore it now. The stark contrast between Rick's bluster and the man's quiet strength. And though the manager thought he had just ended a career, what he had really done was set the stage for his own downfall. Because behind the glass doors of the conference room, footsteps were already approaching, and with them came the truth. The heavy silence in the conference room was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, steady, purposeful. A shadow crossed the frosted glass doors, and then the handle turned. The door opened, and in walked a woman in a charcoal gray suit, her ID badge gleaming with the unmistakable logo of the company's executive board. Her expression was calm, professional, but the room seemed to straighten under her presence. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her tone even but carrying weight. Conversations that hadn't even started yet died instantly. All eyes were on her. Rick's smug grin flickered, replaced by a flash of surprise. He rose halfway from his chair, smoothing his tie. "Ah, Miss Lawson," he said, his voice suddenly syrupy. "What an unexpected visit. We're just wrapping up a meeting." She gave him a polite nod, but her gaze swept past him, scanning the table until it landed on the man sitting quietly, his briefcase closed at his side. Her expression softened for just a moment, a flicker of recognition, before she straightened again. "I won't take much of your time," she continued, "but I've been asked to make an important announcement on behalf of the board of directors." The employees leaned forward in their seats. A murmur rippled through the room. Announcements from the board rarely came unannounced, and certainly not in person. Rick cleared his throat, his grin returning as he tried to seize control again. "Oh, perfect timing," he said loudly. "Actually, I was just addressing some issues with staffing, clearing out inefficiencies, you know how it is. Always keeping the team sharp." But Miss Lawson didn't even glance at him. She clasped her hands together and spoke clearly. "As many of you know, the board has spent the last several months searching for new leadership, someone who embodies the values and future of this company. After an exhaustive search, we are pleased to announce that we've chosen our new Chief Executive Officer." The room buzzed with energy now. Heads turned. Whispers darted between colleagues. Rick chuckled, puffing out his chest as if the moment belonged to him. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with self-importance, "I'm sure whoever it is will be a fine fit. The company deserves strong leadership." Miss Lawson gave him a cool, unreadable look, then turned back to the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice ringing like a gavel, "please welcome your new CEO." The pause was deliberate, electric. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to hang on the next words. And then she gestured, not to Rick, but to the man sitting silently at the table. The very man Rick had just fired. Gasps filled the air. Chairs creaked as employees sat bolt upright. All eyes swung toward the man who had sat quietly through the humiliation, his composure never once breaking. And Rick? His smile cracked, his face draining of color, as though the floor had just dropped out from under him. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. Then, with a small click, Miss Lawson tapped a remote on the conference table. The screen on the wall lit up, the company logo dissolving into a crisp slide. And there he was, the photo of the very same man who had been sitting silently, enduring Rick's humiliation just minutes earlier. His name appeared in bold beneath it. David Carter, Chief Executive Officer. The words were undeniable, official, permanent. The air seemed to leave the room. Employees leaned forward, their jaws slack, their eyes darting between the screen and the man himself. Murmurs rippled through the group like waves. "That's him. He's the CEO. Rick just tried to fire the new boss." Rick's face drained of all color. He stammered, his mouth opening and closing like a man grasping for air. That's impossible," he croaked, sweat prickling at his forehead. I didn't know." David Carter finally rose from his chair. He stood tall, his presence commanding but calm, his expression as steady as it had been since the morning. He adjusted his jacket, then let his gaze sweep the table. When he spoke, his voice was calm, even, but it carried the weight of authority that needed no volume to be felt. "You didn't need to know, Rick. You just needed to show respect. To everyone, regardless of title." The words landed like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples of recognition through the room. Employees who had been silent before now straightened, their eyes filled with something new: admiration, relief, even pride. Miss Lawson smiled faintly, then addressed the room again. The board has every confidence in Mr. Carter's leadership. Effective immediately, he will be guiding this company into its next chapter. I expect each of you to give him the respect and support his position deserves. Polite applause began hesitantly, then swelled into genuine clapping. Some employees even smiled at David with visible gratitude. Meanwhile, Rick sat frozen, his face pale and damp with sweat, his boss man mug trembling slightly in his hand. His authority had crumbled in a single stroke, shattered by the truth projected on the screen behind him. And David Carter, the man he had just tried to dismiss, was now standing not as a worker to be silenced, but as the leader of them all. The sound of applause filled the conference room, first hesitant, then swelling into something undeniable. Employees who had sat in silence during Rick's tirade now clapped with genuine relief, their faces brightening as the truth settled in. David Carter was not a man to be mocked or dismissed. He was their new leader. David let the clapping quiet before speaking again. He didn't need to raise his voice. Authority seemed to flow naturally from him. I came here today not to boast, he began, his calm gaze sweeping across the room, but to listen, to understand the people who make this company what it is. Respect is not a privilege given to a title. It's the foundation of every successful team. And from this day forward, that is the standard we will uphold. His words landed like stones in water, sending ripples through every heart around the table. Some employees exchanged looks of relief. Others nodded, clearly moved. Rick, however, sat rigid in his chair. His face was pale, his hands clenched tightly on the arms of his seat. For once, the man who always had something to say found no words. His earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving only humiliation. David's gaze lingered on him for a moment, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Leadership, David said firmly, is not about tearing others down. It's about lifting them up. Rick's eyes dropped to the table. The smugness was gone, replaced by the unmistakable look of a man who had been stripped bare in front of his peers. David moved to the head of the table, the very seat Rick had claimed for himself minutes earlier. He set his briefcase down, opened it calmly, and began arranging his notes. It was such a simple action, but in it, the shift of power was absolute. The employees straightened in their seats, their applause fading into respectful silence as David Carter, the man once publicly fired, now sat as their CEO. And Rick, he shrank into his chair, smaller than he had ever looked, forced to watch as the authority he had flaunted crumbled in front of him. The balance had shifted. Respect once denied was not only restored, it was permanent. David Carter was in his rightful place, at the head of the table,